This week on Quality Digest Live, when is the right time to flout standard operating procedures?
We're going to find out. Plus, what management can learn from the Panama Canal. That and more when we come back. Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for July 15th, 2016. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest.
And I'm Quality Digest Editor-in-Chief, Dirk Ducharme. Well, it won't be any news to you amateur astronomers out there that NASA's Juno spacecraft has arrived at its destination, the orbit of Jupiter, after a 5-year journey. And, you know, first of all, to me, I'm amazed by this. I mean, you send this 5 years ago, they send this rocket into space and somehow can plan the trajectory and everything so that it arrives 5 years later.
Right on schedule.
Right on schedule.
It landed on schedule, yeah.
Where it's supposed to be on this little dinky, I mean, I can't even get from the bedroom to the bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, it's like 20 feet.
You're not a rocket scientist, Dirk.
I'm not a rocket scientist,
There's a
obviously.
reason for that. There you go.
All right. And what's even cooler is it started sending back pictures like this one right here. You can see that's one of the first pictures back from
cool.
Juno, and we see Jupiter there on the left and the 3 planets, and that's an actual picture. Actually, I don't think it's an actual picture because I don't think that the names of the moons were probably, which actually, if you think about it, would make navigation a lot easier. Or actually naming planets would be a lot easier. It's like, what should we call that?
Well,
oh, hey, look, let's call it Europa.
You know, that's 3 of 67 moons that they know of in the Jupiter system. So
you are full of a lot of information.
I'm full of it. That's right. You know.
All right. Well, the Juno mission, managed by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, has accomplished a number of firsts, including the first planetary spacecraft to make use of 3D printed components. Lockheed Martin Juno's builder used 3D printing to produce about a dozen waveguide titanium brackets for the spacecraft, and to fabricate the parts, Lockheed used a form of metal 3D printing, which uses an electron beam melting machine, this one from Arcam, which uses an electron beam to melt titanium powder 1 layer at a time, layer over layer, to build up a 3D part. Now, this part was then machined into its final shape. I think we've got a picture of it here that we can take a. So on the left, you're seeing the 3D part right out of the printer, and then on the right, kind of a finishing machining job to get the surface finished and drill some holes that they need in it. But you know, actually, there's even more. The KoreaSat 5A and KoreaSat 7, these are telecommunication satellites, also currently under construction, use metal 3D printed parts. But unlike the smallish brackets of Juno, these parts are pretty big. They measure about 17 inches by 15 inches by 8 inches, and I think we have a picture of that here pretty soon. And these are made on a laser-based 3D printed from Laser Concept. And if we throw that picture up right now, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the brackets are about 18 inches tall. These are very complex shapes, all done in one go, one printing process. So you might think, why do 3D printed parts? Why are these aerospace companies interested in them? Well, for Lockheed Martin, it was actually time and cost. It was faster and cheaper to 3D print these titanium parts than it was to have them made in a traditional method. Even considering that post-processing was needed on the 3D part, it was still faster and cheaper. For the KoreaSat parts, built by Thales Alenia Space, you could add to those reasons of cost and speed, weight savings. As we have mentioned before, you can 3D print parts that can't be otherwise made. So in the case of, let's say, the KoreaSat, in the past, those brackets that we just saw were actually constructed out of 9 separate parts. So you have 9 precision parts that have to be made, then they have to be assembled, and there's a weight associated with all that as well. So now they are made from one 3D printed metal part. This one happens to be out of an aluminum alloy, which leads to a 22% savings in weight versus their traditional method, as well as being less expensive to make as well. So keep in mind, for space travel, weight is key. It currently costs about 20,000 euros to put 1 kilogram payload
No.
into space. So anywhere you can go and shave weight off, that's really key. So they're looking at these weight, even if sometimes if it's just a few grams.
Sure.
It's like if we can save a few grams per screw, multiplied, let's say, by 100 screws, well, there you go, 100 grams.
Yeah, sure, exactly.
So we've been talking for a while, especially for rapid prototyping, that 3D printing can be a real time and money saver, but more and more we are seeing 3D printed be used for low volume, critical parts, end user parts being made for an end product. So it's really interesting to see them make this transition from really what used to be just rapid prototyping into mainstream production.
The production, right away.
It's pretty cool stuff.
It is pretty cool stuff. I mean, the Juno satellite is going to actually, it's intended to be destroyed in the Jupiter atmosphere, apparently.
Right.
It's interesting, as a side note to this, it's interesting why they're doing that. Why they're destroying it is because they don't want it to have any chance of potentially crashing into Europa.
Right.
Because there's a theory that Europa may actually harbor life. So they don't want to have that potential life on Europa.
I saw that movie.
Be 2010.
No, Europa.
Oh, Europa, that one too.
Europa.
It's a good one.
Yeah, you don't want to
mess with that life. Yeah. So that's why they're crashing it into and they're burning it up, because they don't want any.
I didn't realize
possibility.
the life thing. I thought they just didn't want to damage the moons for some reason.
No, they feel like there might possibly be some life in Europa, so they're saying, you know what, let's not take any chances.
Okay.
We don't want to contaminate that potential life form, if there is a life form.
We'll kill those poor guys down on Jupiter. Sorry.
There might be life on Jupiter too. Who knows?
Didn't know you were there.
Great story. All right, thanks, Dirk. All right, well, if there's one golden rule of quality, it probably has something to do with the inviolability of procedures. An organization that's truly fulfilling its mandate within the marketplace and addressing customer requirements in a pristine way is probably doing so because it's established solid procedures that it always follows to the letter, right? Now, that sounds good, don't you think? I mean, it sounds right, sounds accurate, but is it always true? In their article, Is the Time Ever Right to Flout Procedure, which you see right there, authors Loïc Sadulé and Thomas Hinterseer take a rather contrarian view of this established wisdom. Their article originally appeared on the excellent InSeed blog, and we republished it in Tuesday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. And by the way, before I proceed, InSeed's got some really interesting, thought-provoking stuff on there. They're an education facility, and it's kind of like a virtual educational institute. So it's online, I think, is primarily where they aggregate and have most of their
learning. Yeah, they got some good writers
Excellent.
over there.
This piece is tremendously well written and has some really thought-provoking takeaways. So in the article, again, Sadulé and Hinterseer point out a couple of examples, and both of these came from the energy sector, in which following procedures in the absence of common sense led to or greatly compounded a disaster. And one of those was the Deepwater Horizon tragedy that we've all known so much about. Well, the authors also point, though, to an example from the aircraft MRO space in which technicians deviated from an established procedure for reasons that seem logical, quite frankly, from a rather narrow short-term perspective, but which also led to tragedy, in this case, a crash that cost the lives of nearly 300 people. I'm not going to get too far into those three individual cases, but read the article because it's interesting to see how they draw those conclusions and why they say that, these first two cases, procedures were followed and there was disaster, and the third case, procedures weren't followed and there was disaster. And so you can kind of get it from both ends. And again, therein, I think, lays the problem with whether or not to flap procedures. It's possible to be damned if you do and damned if you don't. Sometimes you need to override a procedure. Sometimes you need to follow it to the T. Doing so or not can have major repercussions, and knowing what you should do in real time as the situation unfolds really, to me, is the key to whether or not a person in that position acted correctly or not. It's also, though, somewhat, at least, a matter of odds, right? I mean, think about it. If following procedure is the correct action 9 times out of 10, were you wrong to follow it on that 10th time when disaster struck, right? I mean, it's kind of,
a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking.
To me, it's almost analogous to, to driving drunk, if you think about it. I mean, or any misbehavior that you do personally. I mean, you may not get caught, but just because you don't get caught doesn't mean it was the right thing to do, right? I mean, if you do it and you're kind of risking it, you're going to get caught eventually, but just because you don't get caught doesn't mean it wasn't the wrong thing to do. I mean, it's not all about outcome, is what I'm saying
Right.
here, right? The procedure, the process that goes into the outcome is really important too. And these are complicated issues. And the author's takeaway, I think, and mine, is that really to deal with this issue properly, you have to train your people, and you have to train them to contemplate as broadly as they can the possible implications. I always get that word wrong. I say implications.
Starting to talk like me.
The possible implications of situations as they unfold, and not only as they unfold, before they unfold too, right? You have to think through all those things, and you have to do it after too, for the purposes of training. So you think about it before it happens, you think about it while it's happening, you think about it after it happened, to look back and see what you can learn about that. And you want to work through all those possibilities and consider what actions to take in any and all potential circumstances. I mean, you can never account for all eventualities, it's just impossible, but this exercise will help you and your people to at least understand what's, I think, potentially at stake. And you don't want to encourage people to flout procedure, but you also don't want them to be so myopic that they put people's lives at risk. And that's true. I think that there's a broad sense of this where you have to use your judgment. I mean, it's risk-based thinking. At the heart of this is risk-based thinking, right? I mean, essentially, you're telling people that we need to have a risk assessment going into everything we're doing, all of our processes and all our procedures. Earlier in the story, I mentioned this idea that maybe 9 out of 10 times, doing this will, following procedure will lead to a good outcome, and
Right.
1 out of 10 times maybe it won't. But if you do your risk management, if you do your risk-based thinking, and you determine that, well, geez, 90% of the time will be okay, but we have a 10% factor where something is going to go wrong in a bad way, well, you need to re-envision that procedure or that process. That's way too high, right? I mean, 99 times out of 100, 999 times out of 1,000, I mean, these are all probably still too high. So depending on what the potential outcome will be. And that's really the idea of like an FMEA and the whole risk-based thinking process.
It's interesting. Your story right here actually leads in a way into my story coming up here in a minute, is in order for people to do the right actions, they really have to understand the real facts.
Yes.
And which means you have to be very good at communicating. What are the facts of our job? What are the facts of our customers? What are the facts of whatever it is we do, so that you understand why this procedure is in place, why it does what it does, and so forth. Because if you have a misconception about what your company does, or what your job does, or what somebody else's job does, or whatever, if you're acting on misconceptions, then you're acting on misinformation, and you're more than likely going to do things that are wrong. Okay, and so it's very important for people to understand the facts of what they do. Which is a perfect lead-in to a story, believe it or not, on Panama Canal.
That's right.
Say it.
You gonna sing it?
No. Panama.
There you go. I knew you wanted to. See, I knew you wanted to, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to do it. There you go.
You guys are all familiar with the Panama Canal. World shipping changed forever when the Panama Canal opened on August 15th, 1914. So writes Frank Townsend in his article, How the Panama Canal Expansion Will Once Again Transform Shipping. And it was an engineering marvel of its day, cutting the distance required to get from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic by as much as 8,000 nautical miles. I mean, this was a huge achievement. And actually, it was great for the ships of the day, and even for the next roughly, let's say, 80, 90 years. But ships, eventually got bigger and bigger, particularly the huge container ships, to the point where they don't fit through the existing locks. So the old locks, for instance, are 110 feet wide, and the newer ships can be up to 150 feet wide. So yeah, you can kind of see the problem.
That's a draft issue too. It's not just the width.
Yes, also a draft issue, the depth of the ships. Which is why more than a decade ago, the Panama Canal expansion project was started to expand the width of the Panama Canal. My language may have been a little imprecise, but we'll get back to that later.
Be precise now. This is an issue.
If you've forgotten how the canal, and believe this is leading to something, we're leading up to something here. If you've forgotten how the canal works, as I apparently did, as we will see, ships enter the canal from one ocean, pass through a series of 3 chambers or locks, which lift the vessels up to a higher level of Gatun or Gatun Lake, which is a man-made lake. The ships then traverse the lake, go through another set of locks, which lowers them back down to sea level on the other side. In fact, I think we have a slide here which kind of demonstrates that. So yeah, you can see on the left-hand side, one set of locks, right-hand side, another set of locks, and about 40 or 50 miles of lakes in between. Now, despite how headlines describe the project, it is not a widening of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is 60 miles long. We did not widen the entire canal. It is a widening of the locks at each end of the Panama Canal. Actually, a new set of wider locks that are in parallel to the existing locks. And we have a picture of what this actually looks like. There you go. So on the left-hand side of the screen are the existing locks. On the right-hand side of the screen are the newer, wider locks. It's an amazing bit of engineering, both the locks and the new locks. Now, aside from the fact that the Panama Canal is interesting history and interesting engineering, why do you care? Well, I'll kind of come at this sideways.
You already did.
In talking about this canal story in our editorial meetings, it came up that a few of us had forgotten how the canal worked. We honed in on all the headlines for the last 10 years, expand the width of the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
And it became my firm belief and the firm belief of others that they were making this huge channel 60 miles across the Isthmus of Panama. What an amazing engineering feat.
Right, exactly. But no.
No, it wasn't. That isn't really what it was. We had this preconception of what this project entailed because of what we thought the facts were and because of how the project was described in headlines, and we didn't really research it well enough. There's a name for this. Kind of the psychological name is confabulation, which really is just a term that means if we don't know something, we can't have a gap. So we fill in the gaps with fabricated knowledge. We make up, and then what's worse is then we actually begin to believe it.
Yeah.
And this can be caused by a lot of things, and this is also goes by another name called the Mandela effect. And if you want to have some interesting reading, read up on the Mandela effect.
Yeah.
But they're basically the same idea, is where a large group of people comes to believe that something is a truism. So, and the Mandela effect comes from the belief of a large group of people that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the late 1980s or something like that. And he died in prison,
many years ago. At least he did not.
Not in this universe, anyway.
Right.
And there's other ones, the Berenstain, Bear. There's a whole bunch of things where people honestly believe that something is a certain way. Now, this happens in our jobs as well, where we unwittingly create what eventually ends up being straw men, right? Is for whatever reason we develop beliefs about who our company's customers are. I've talked to 2 or 3 of our customers, and they have told me that. And the conversation never existed. Now that person isn't lying.
Right.
It's just they so strongly believe, maybe by innuendo or whatever, that this is what their customers want, and so then it becomes a real life conversation that they've actually had in their mind.
Yeah.
And these conversations existed. Or my management does this, or this is what our company stands for. It's in the manual.
Yeah.
And it completely isn't true. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, the other place where this manifests itself, which is actually discrediting a lot of the way that court actions work now, is eyewitness testimony.
Oh, sure.
Eyewitness testimony has been shown to be tremendously unreliable.
Right.
And now it's actually beginning to be used less and less, and it's because it's been discredited to a large extent.
So much.
Because people really think that they saw such and such do this and that happened. They didn't.
And it
didn't happen.
And again, is part of that confabulation or Mandela effect is we believe, once we get in our mind that something is a certain way, then we start creating a fictitious backstory. But we don't know that the backstory is fictitious. In our mind, that backstory is true.
It's true.
And we do it in our work environments as well.
Yeah, we do. It's true.
So what is the upshot of this? What do you do about that? Well, to me, what happens is from, let's say, a project point of view or change management, the first thing you've got to do is lay out the facts of where we are right now, even to the point of saying things and laying out facts that should be we think, self-evident or widely known. Because for a lot of people, they may not be.
Yeah.
You may be going along fat, dumb, and happy thinking your company has this in place, that in place, certain beliefs.
Right.
When all of a sudden, the CEO of the company gets up and says, okay, now before we start this meeting, let me tell you where we're at today, and lays out the minutia, even the little stuff, and you go, oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not what I believe. But it's important. It's important to lay that factual groundwork before you try to implement change. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're trying to row upstream against what the cultural belief is, based on these facts that are in everybody's mind, which aren't facts at all.
Yeah, and the other thing that complicates this, even as you talk about,
even more complicated than
even
how
more complicated than that.
Okay, right.
is the idea that you may talk to a customer who gives you feedback, and maybe what you're relating is actually true. The customer's telling you what they believe is true, which may not be, because they may have their own preconceptions.
Right.
So there's this idea of telephone going on too, where you're hearing something. Maybe you're hearing it accurately. Maybe you're even reporting it accurately, but maybe the source wasn't accurate.
And look, and I know everybody has had this happen. You're talking to a customer, and the customer says something like, "Yeah, our quality control guys say that every batch you send us is bad."
Right.
Yeah, I just talked to my QC guy yesterday, and he told me that what he got from you was bad.
Yeah.
And the person saying that, the manager, whatever, firmly believes it. And then you go and you talk to the QC guy, and he goes, we got one bad part from you last week. Yeah, I mentioned it to the what?
Yeah, right.
And it just gets a lot of reasons why this happens, including alternate universe, but we won't go into that.
But it's a complicated issue. It gets deeply into the personalities of the people involved, and there's also motivating factors. People are motivated to sometimes say something that they know isn't really true, and
the thing is, and then begin to believe it. And that's where you lose sight. Sometimes it may start off as knowing it's an outright lie, and then over time you've said it so much you forget that you were lying about it in the first place. It's become true.
It's become true. Amazing how the human brain works. Amazing how we get from the Panama Canal to that.
I tell you,
the human brain.
I had a plan.
It's amazing. That's right. A man, a plan, Panama. There you go.
Thank you, Mike. I knew you'd do
All right. All right. Well, we had a Tech Corner scheduled with Tribogenics, but at the last minute, conflict meant that we had to move that segment to a later date. So stay tuned. We'll be bringing you that Tech Corner on an upcoming episode of Quality Digest Live. Meanwhile, we have a last story for you called Looking Under the Hood of Annoying Management Speak. And here it is right there by Erica Darrix. Looking under the hood of annoying management. Actually, it was looking under the boot or the bonnet of annoying management speak, as it was first done, because yes, it was not she's not an American, but it was great. Interesting article, because really what this article talks about is management speak, as we hear, drilling down, picking your brain, helicopter view, all those types of things that are used. And she's careful in the beginning of this article to really lay out a key difference here in this thing, which is the difference between jargon and idiomatic language. When people talk about management speak, they very often, even journalists, will loosely say jargon, management jargon. Well, that's not really true. Jargon is its own type of speech. Right. Jargon is generally very technical. It relates to specific things that are understood only by a certain number of people. Idiomatic language is much more picturesque, and it's much more to the entire group, a larger group than jargon itself. So the idea that management speak is really more idiomatic language than jargon, it really is the first thing that we have to understand, because things like, again, pick your brain. I mean, that's not jargon, that's really an idiomatic phrase of speech, turn of speech, which is, I think, important. The idea that she's getting at here is actually not that different from what Dirk just said. This idea of how you use words and how truth really emerges from that. And I think that it's interesting because, when people use idiomatic language, they're not doing it to obfuscate. The criticism that, as Erica Darrix says in her piece, that journalists often take with this is the criticism is that, they're doing this to kind of separate themselves out from there. They're thinking they're special and all this kind of stuff. Right. Not really. I mean, if if you look at idiomatic speech and idiomatic language, it's really more to be inclusive. It's to use, again, these turns of phrases that are very colorful to communicate an idea. And many times it communicates an idea much more quickly and much more colorfully than you can.
Sometimes it's a shortcut.
It's a shortcut, exactly right. And it also many times helps to dampen what could be potentially an emotional situation. She used the example of when, you maybe as a manager, need to have a conversation with somebody about something that's important maybe. You can send an email that says, I need to see you in my office now, which communicates something and maybe has a negative connotation, versus, I want you to come to my office so I can pick your brain. Which is, does it mean anything? Not really, or kind of, but it's also softer. Yeah. It's also more of a kind of a clubby, almost, hey, we're going to talk about some stuff, and
Mike, I need you to think outside of the box rather than Mike, you're so stupid. Yeah. How come you can't you broaden your horizons?
Jerk, what are you saying? You just told me we wanted to think outside the box in the story like 20 minutes ago. But anyway, this is the key that she's getting at here, is this idea that the language, and all language is used for this purpose. And again, it kind of goes back to the Mandela effect. I mean, it's like how you use language to express truth and what that truth then becomes. And I think that, within the realm of management, I think it's important to be inclusive, and I think it's important to communicate and to have a cohesion. And I think that these terms, again, as the author indicates, really are more cohesive than they're divisive. I mean, again, journalists will pick on the divisiveness of this and say, well, they're using that just because they want to be on their own. But really, it's there to be cohesive and to communicate in a way that you can't really do through much more precise and much more technical language. I think it's important to remember.
It's interesting. I was just reading an article on. It was similar. It was terminology that we use in the enlightened workplace, and how some of those terms maybe aren't so enlightened. And one that I'm just remembering right now was the term empower, which, if you think about it, if you think about the way it's used, it's actually just the opposite. Mike, I'm going to empower you.
You?
Yes,
right.
I am going to empower you. So who's holding the power?
Exactly right.
Exactly.
That's right.
And there's a lot of terms like that where if you really get down to it, it's like, no, I'm not sure. And another one was tolerate or tolerance. We have to have tolerance. And she says, I would hate to be on the receiving side. I would hate to know that somebody's tolerating me. You shouldn't have to tolerate me. You should accept me, but tolerate me is a whole nother thing.
Tolerance,
and that was another one of her bugaboo words, is empowerment, tolerance.
Yeah.
They don't really mean what you might think they mean, or maybe what they should be.
Well, think about this. And we talked to our friend Kelly Graves about this too. Think about the difference between management and leadership. Right? I mean, to manage, connotes a certain level of, I'm the boss, you're the underling, I'm gonna be on you to do this, rather than to lead or to train or to share. There's different ways of doing that are, again, the language is softer and it's more inclusive than maybe a very one-way relationship. And all these terms are really important. And let's be honest, it touches on PC too. I mean, in the broader society, these terms touch on political correctness and how much you need to be politically correct versus can you go too far with political correctness? All these issues are very intimately entwined here. So I think it's important to publish these articles. This is why we like to publish articles like this in Quality Digest Daily, because it gives a broad perspective.
Right, and I think kind of the upshot of it is sometimes you're better off just saying exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to couch it in, even though it may make for a longer sentence, sometimes it just makes sense just to use the words as the English language was designed to use them.
But sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes it's proper and better to use an idiom and to use a language.
You mean just in terms of softening?
Or to communicate something that's just difficult to communicate with those very precise, almost technical words. It's more art than science.
Well, don't you think though that sometimes, so Mike, Jeff just called me to his office. He says he wants to pick my brain, and you're going, oh, I know what that means. Well, after a while, don't they lose kind of the softening? It's like, oh, pick your brain. Oh, yeah, well, I bet he has a pink slip laying on the desk.
It just depends. I mean, sure, if you are going to, as a boss, really need to have a difficult corrective conversation with an employee, maybe you could say I want to pick your brain, but maybe you want to be more precise in that initial email. There's innumerable ways of saying something and saying the same thing. But I think the idea here is that idiomatic language is not the enemy. It's not this problem that people make it out to be, because you understand. I mean, I know what you're saying when you say I want to pick your brain. I mean, I know what you're saying. You want to have a conversation. You want to explore some ideas. Maybe you want to challenge me on some things too. That's okay. But come to my office now, I've talked to you about something, it's different. It feels different, you know what I'm saying? So it's just interesting to think about the word choices. We're editors, so we understand this. Word choice is important, and it definitely communicates different ideas.
We be editors. All right, well, speaking of words, it's time for Tweet of the Week.
That's right. Some great words for you right now.
Throw that one up there on the screen. All right, this week's Tweet of the Week comes from Aaron Levy. Nintendo's mobile strategy. 2008, what's an iPhone? 2010, what's an Android? 2012, nope. 2014, still no. 2016, change how society functions. There you go.
What were you saying?
Change how society.
I was looking at my iPhone.
Yeah, it was like
I was playing Pokemon Go there. Sorry.
Hey, hey, I knew there was one here in the room.
The ubiquitous iPhones. That's right. We love them. That's our tweet of the week. Yeah, it's interesting to see the development of iPhones. We love those things.
I needed something else to do with my phone.
There you go.
I could go around looking for Pokemons. 1 o'clock in the morning.
Or right now, you're going to be on that thing in about 2 minutes.
20 other people.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Wandering around in the dark.
That is our phones. That is our show. Dirk's going to now play with his iPhone, and I'm going to get back to work. So thank you all for joining us on this week's Quality Digest Live. We'll be back at you on Monday with another big week of QDD, and of course, we'll be back at you next Friday with another big Quality Digest Live. So you all have a great weekend. We'll see you then.
So long.
Bye.